Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, December 3rd, 2022. We begin with our sister Ziony, cruising the highway of history, giving us the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Arleen Marcia Tuchman, the Nelson O. Tyrone Jr. Chair in History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Professor Tuchman is the author of the book, Diabetes: History of Race and Disease, and she'll be sharing her work as a medical historian studying this disease that is no stranger to the Black community. Stay tuned, and I'm certain you may learn something valuable for yourself, your family, or maybe even your friends. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Professor V.P. Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at the University of California at Riverside and former editor of the award-winning Journal of African American History. Today, he's on the horn with Dr. Horne to discuss his book, The Young Crusaders, the untold story of the children and teenagers who galvanized the civil rights movement. Professor Franklin will be shedding some light on the youngest participants in a movement that was far from child's play. Do not touch that radio because you won't want to miss this history. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure that your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Jay Dilla, Charlie Parker, Max Roach, Ahmad Jamal, Freddie Hubbard, and Horace Silver. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Arleen Marcia Tuchman.
We say it is only when they begin their history in their state of freedom that they can come to properly understand their role. Thus, all Africans in America who begin their history in 1619 can never solve the problems they face. Those truly seeking to solve their people's problems must begin their history in Africa.
Alafia, this is your sister Zaini with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, where every day is History Day. So as long as every day we are oppressed as Africans. December 5th, 1958, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the anti-colonial leader and first prime minister of Ghana, convened the All-African People's Conference. This conference was the first post-slavery, post-colonial conference of independent African nations, fulfilling Nkrumah's inaugural pledge that independence of Ghana means nothing as long as African people anywhere were oppressed. The conference objective was to globally coordinate the decolonization and de-neo-colonialization of African and African people worldwide and the building of a United States of Africa. Within a 10-year period, over 70% of African countries gained independence from colonialism. Today, we are struggling with neo-colonialism, whose graveyard will be in Africa. December 6, 1961. Frantz Fanon, Pan-Africanist, Caribbean-born, French-educated staff psychologist for the French Colonial Army, Division of Interrogation in Algeria, dies. Frantz Fanon commits class suicide and becomes a member of the National Liberation Front of Algeria, with a prolific writer on the psychology of colonialism. His most famous book was The Wretched of the Earth, becomes the Bible of psychology of the oppressed and oppressor, as well as Black Skins, White Masks, which unmasks the cultural vampire nature of European colonial culture. December 6, 1919, Melchora Aquino, revolutionary Filipino independence activist, crosses over. She was imprisoned for providing weapons, storage, and communications to the anti-Spanish resistance forces seeking to gain Filipino independence. December 7, 1987. Libya, under the revolutionary leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, nationalizes the former British oil fields, setting into motion the de-neo-colonialization of Libya and joins the rank of truly independent African nations, free not only from political control, but from European capitalist economic control. A North African country that is in the vanguard of Pan-Africanism and the African Union. December 9, 1961. Tanganyika gains independence under Mwalimu Nyerere under the banner of Ujamaa socialism, thereby uniting the African island of Zanzibar, creating a nation of Tanzania. The Arusha Declaration was Tanzania's political declaration of building socialism based on the horticultural commune system. December 11, 1895. Dolores Lowry, nicknamed the La Pasionera, better to die on your feet than on your knees. She was the most famous Spanish freedom fighter and a communist who fought against the capitalist fascist dictator Franco in the Spanish Civil War. December 10, 1956. Movement for the Liberation of Angola is founded and leads the people of Angola to liberation after 400-plus years of Portuguese colonialism. Angola's MPLA fought the racist regime of South Africa, Rhodesia, and Portugal, all backed by the United States to build a socialist, independent Angola. The Latin American country of Cuba provides military support in the spirit of internationalism to assist Angola in defeating South African and Western imperialism through direct military defeat of the combined white forces and their Uncle Tom, Jonas, Savimbi, and UNITA. This has been Sister Ziny with our Revolutionary African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. We want to praise up our revolutionary ancestors who have made our present existence possible by hailing up the words of our Tanzanian brothers and sisters. Power to the people. Amandala.
Away-tu.
Amandala.
Away-tu.
Amandala.
Away-tu.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Arleen Marcia Tuchman, Nelson O. Tyrone Jr. Chair in History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and author of the book, Diabetes, History of Race and Disease. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Tuchman.
I'm glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. So why did you write this book, and what is diabetes, by the way?
So I wrote this book because I was interested in learning more about the history of disease. I am an historian of medicine, and I was finishing up one project and looking around for the next book and knew that I wanted to do something on the history of disease. And right around that time, my dad, who had been diagnosed with diabetes when he was in his mid-60s, he decided to move to Nashville, where I live. And I just started thinking that it would be really interesting to dive more deeply into a disease that at that point he'd been living with for almost 20 years. So I started reading around about what had already been published on the history of diabetes and learned pretty quickly that most books were about what we now call type 1 diabetes, or when I grew up, we referred to it as juvenile diabetes. It's basically where the form where the body's not producing any insulin. And that there was very little about the more common form of diabetes, which we now refer to as type 2. When I was growing up, we referred to it as adult onset diabetes. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look into this other form of the disease? And there was a little bit written about it, not much, but I learned pretty quickly that diabetes had at one point been considered a Jewish disease. And that floored me, because what I was reading in the early 2000s about the populations that were most likely to develop diabetes was that it was African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans. And so that's the kind of puzzle that just grabbed me. I wanted to understand better how diabetes had gone through such a radical change in susceptible populations.
So you laid out the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which is supposedly connected to Black Americans.
So today, African Americans are considered to be one of the populations most likely to develop type 2 diabetes. It usually appears later in life, but that's not always the case any longer.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned in your opening remarks that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, diabetes was considered a so-called Jewish disease.
Right.
Is there something in diabetes itself that makes it susceptible to being perceived racially or ethnically?
I would say probably not. My first thought was that it may have something to do with the fact that it is perceived and always has been perceived to be also a lifestyle disease. But there are other diseases that also have been viewed through a racial lens. Schizophrenia, cancer, fetal alcohol syndrome. So diabetes is not alone in being perceived to have a connection to a racialized population. What is unusual about the history of diabetes is that it has been associated with so many different racialized populations over time.
Mm-hmm. Now, Black Americans are perceived, or were perceived, perhaps are perceived, as having a less developed nervous system. What does that mean, and what did it imply? And should I have used the past tense or present tense?
Well, I think the past tense would be more appropriate. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when diabetes rates were increasing drastically, and the medical community and public health communities started writing a lot about what was going on with diabetes. At the same time, what was a very common belief is what we refer to as scientific racism. That is the idea that that races were biological in origin, and that you could place the different races on a ladder from the most evolved to from the least evolved to the most evolved. And one of the ways in which the truth of this ladder, and I'm using scare quotes around truth, one of the ways in which the validity of this ladder was demonstrated was by looking at or claiming that those at the upper end of the ladder had a more developed nervous system, and those at the bottom of the ladder had a less developed nervous system. So the state of one's nervous system was believed to indicate how advanced, how civilized a particular race might have been. And the claim was that African Americans and Native Americans were not as developed evolutionarily, that they were less evolved, and white Americans were the most evolved, the most civilized, the most advanced.
Mm-hmm. Now, why and how were Native Americans and Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans perceived as having or not having a predilection for diabetes? And I guess you can reference in your response your previous reference to so-called lifestyle diseases and what that means.
So each of these populations were considered to be most likely to have diabetes at very different times. One of the really startling discoveries that I made when I was writing this book, not reading it, is that when Jews in the early 20th century, and actually whites in general, were believed to have the highest prevalence of diabetes, because they believed that diabetes was closely connected to the nervous system. The framing that came with the disease was to read diabetes as a disease of civilization. So, Jewish physicians in the early 20th century didn't deny that their population had high rates of diabetes. They just had a somewhat different explanation for it. but they viewed it as a consequence of being as civilized and as advanced as they were. When and this sort of positive read on diabetes, viewing it as a disease of civilization, is what predominated in the first half of the 20th century. But when Native Americans came to be seen as the population with the highest rate of diabetes, and a few decades later with Mexican Americans, diabetes was no longer seen as a disease of civilization. It was seen as a disease of, especially with Native Americans, as a disease of individuals who had primitive bodies, who had not evolved as far as whites. And so it then came to be read as a negative disease. And as far as linking this to lifestyle, I mean, when diabetes was viewed as a disease of Jews, it was also linked to lifestyle, but it was high living. It was eating rich foods. It was eating too many delicacies. And when it was viewed, and in terms of like employment and jobs, it was that they were too sedentary because their work was work at desks and banks, and that this was the work of highly educated individuals. When it was viewed as a disease of lifestyle with Native Americans, so it was genetic, but it was also lifestyle. It was more linked with being lazy, with not being active. And so what's so interesting is, in some ways, it's still the same, right? It's eating the wrong foods, and it's how much you're moving or exercising. But it's framed as either because in the early 20th century, Jews were among the most educated and civilized. And then when it was associated with Native Americans and Mexican Americans, it's a totally different frame.
Is there something about the training of physicians and researchers, or is there something about society itself that predisposes these medics to see diabetes or other diseases as connected more to, quote, race, unquote, than the environment, for example?
Well, I mean, I would say that in general, we pay far more attention in this country to race as a way of categorizing people and classifying people and dividing people than we do to class. There's a really interesting paper that came out decades ago that argued that whereas in the United States we pay attention to race and much less to class, in England they paid attention to class and much less to race. And so it's a long history going back into the 18th and 19th centuries in this country of explaining health disparities, of explaining difference by looking to race rather than rather than place or class or any other kind of category. So I don't think it's peculiar to the training of physicians or any kind of healthcare practitioners in this country. I think that what I would say is that the healthcare training in this country is not immune to the basic categories of differentiation that exist in this country.
Mm-hmm. In other words, the doctors are imbibing this from society as a whole.
Yeah, they're imbibing it from society, and then medicine is one of the places where it gets constantly, constantly reinscribed and perpetuated and transmitted. It's one of the major places where this continues to be replicated. Although I will say that since this book came out, I have been invited to speak at a lot of medical schools there, and I think it's to some extent because of the pandemic and COVID and how this pandemic has laid bare once again the health disparities in this country, that there's a lot of interest and a lot of self-reflection about what might be going on in medical schools and in medical practices that might be perpetuating the kind of racial discrimination that I reveal in this book.
Speaking of which, what is meant by a, quote, thrifty, unquote, gene?
Yeah, so the thrifty gene hypothesis was developed in the 1960s, early 1960s, by a geneticist by the name of Neal. And he was really interested in why diabetes was increasing so rapidly throughout the world. And he had done some work on sickle cell anemia. He knew about the link between sickle cell anemia and malaria, that people who have sickle cell have a kind of protection from malaria. And he wondered, might there be some kind of a gene or genetic basis that could explain why diabetes might be conferring some kind of evolutionary advantage. And so he came up with a story. He just imagined that that early humans had a spectrum of genetic makeup, and that those who had what he called a thrifty gene might have been better able to store lots of food during times of feast, when there was plenty of food around, so that when famines would come, they would better be able to survive the famines. And he said that would have conferred a selective advantage on those who had this thrifty genotype. And then they would survive the periods of famine, whereas the others would die off. And that is how the thrifty genotype might have become established in the human population, which was an advantage until the time came where there were no longer serious famines, when there was always plenty. And at that point, having the thrifty genotype would put you at a disadvantage. And that was where he stopped, but it didn't take long. He published this in the early 1960s, and it didn't take long before others said that must be what's going on with this rapid increase in diabetes among Native American populations.
So in other words, this thrifty gene idea, it's still considered to be good medicine, so to speak.
There aren't any people who study human genetics or who do medical anthropology or any of that who think the thrifty gene hypothesis has any validity at all.
I see.
But it just won't die off. And the truth is that even if there is a genetic component to diabetes, and since there's some genetic component to most diseases, clearly there's something genetic that is also influencing who develops diabetes and when they develop it. But most of diabetes, and no one questions this, comes about because of non-genetic factors. And we have a tendency to focus on lifestyle But that masks all of the structural and social factors that contribute to why people live different kinds of lives, what kinds of resources they have available to them, all of the structural impediments to living a healthy life.
Finally, Professor Tuchman, Nelson O. Tyrone Jr., Chair in History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville and author of the book Diabetes, History of Race and Disease. You've mentioned schizophrenia, fetal alcohol syndrome, and I'm wondering, at the top of the list, what other diseases today, other than diabetes, have been shaped by these so-called race discourses, more so than class, poverty, environment, etc.?
Well, I would say hypertension for sure. That would be far up there. Kidney disease. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right now.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Tuchman. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. It is now time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who is now being joined by Professor V.P. Franklin. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Professor V.P. Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at the University of California at Riverside. From 2001 to 2018, he was editor of the award-winning Journal of African American History. And today he will be discussing his recent book, The Young Crusaders, The Untold Story of the Children and Teenagers Who Galvanized the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Franklin.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be on the program. I'm really happy to be able to be part of your audience and a part of your program today.
And we're happy that you joined us. So, why did you write this book, The Young Crusaders?
Well, I was working on an earlier book with Betty Collier Thomas. It's My Soul is a Witness, a chronology of the Civil Rights era, 1954 to 1965. And that was a reference book where we documented civil rights campaigns across the country during that period, utilizing the New York Times, Jet Magazine, and the Southern School News. My Soul as a Witness was published in 2001. While we were doing the research in the New York Times, in Jet Magazine, and in the Southern School News, I was struck by the large numbers of incidents and campaigns and protests where children were involved. And so I started picking those out. I started identifying campaigns across the country where children participated and teenagers participated, and sometimes they led these campaigns. And then I began to gather up more information about those protests, and I put together an article on Black high school students and civil rights campaigns, and it was published in 2001. That article was published in 2001. But that was also the year I became editor of the Journal of Negro History, which I wanted to name now the Journal of African American History. And so when I became editor of the Journal of African American History, I devoted some special issues to civil rights campaigns and to student protests at high school and college level. But I wasn't able to pursue the book. I wasn't able to pursue the larger study until I took advantage of the 50th anniversary of the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. Most people know about the attacks on the children and teenagers by the police for using dogs and fire hoses, etc., and the children, and thousands of children were arrested. And so we had images of that, and there's actually a film called The Children's March, which documents that. And so I used the 50th anniversary, 2013, as a time to commemorate children and teenagers' activities across the country. And I got my students at the University of California, Riverside, to engage in research on the activities of children in protests and teenagers in protests across the country. And so in 2013, we had an exhibit on children and teenagers' contributions to the civil rights movement. And then in 2014, we had an exhibit which focused more on Freedom Summer, the Freedom Schools, but campaigns around the country. And then that exhibit traveled to other university libraries around the country. And so that when I was finally turned over the reins of the editorship of the Journal of African American History to Pero Dagbovie at Michigan State University, that was in 2018. So beginning in 2019, I could devote my time to documenting, to putting together the book, The Young Crusaders, which came out last year. And so that's the background to the study. I had been working with my students at the University of California, Riverside to document children's protests, not just in the South, but throughout the country. And so the book, The Young Crusaders, is a survey. It doesn't deal with all of the protests that children and teenagers engaged in, but it focuses in on the activities of the NAACP youth councils in the 1930s and 1940s. Their teenagers' participation in public school boycotts of high schools beginning in the 1940s and in 1950s. And then I document the children who were asked to participate in the public and private school desegregation. So we think of the Little Rock Nine, for example. Little Rock Nine, who desegregated Central High School in 1957. But I document, and what my students were able to document is other cities and towns where children and teenagers were asked. They were asked by adults, usually in the NAACP, to agree to become the first African Americans enrolled in previously all-white public schools, and this is at the elementary level. For example, when you think of New Orleans, Ruby Bridges, and in 1960 desegregating William Franz Elementary School in 1960. But I document this to children and teenagers across the country in various places who were asked to desegregate previously all-white public elementary and secondary schools.
Mm-hmm. And you also, of course, discussed the Scottsboro case of the 1930s, these 9 Black youth in Alabama charged falsely and maliciously with sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women, leading to a global campaign to free them. That was one of the more stellar examples of participation of youth in knocking down the walls of Jim Crow. But I guess the general question is, why did children and teenagers play such a large role in the anti-Jim Crow movement? Was it because their parents were more constrained, or was it because the students were more motivated politically to see change?
Well, Gerald, it was a combination of things. You have to keep in mind that once the NAACP began launching these campaigns to desegregate public education that led up to the Brown decision, the parents, most of the cases, in the 4 cases of the that make up the Brown decision, it was the parents who wanted their children to desegregate all white public elementary or secondary schools. And so the children were recruited by the parents, by NAACP leaders, to agree to participate in this school desegregation process. And so that's how they became involved. They were recruited, and usually it was students who were very, very successful in their previously all Black schools. A lot of times they were officers in the student government. They were well-known athletes, but they were asked to sacrifice all of that, all they had achieved in their all Black public school, to desegregate the white school, where they would be subject to attacks, subject to vicious mobs, etc., that of white children, parents who didn't want them there. And so many of the children were recruited, to participate in civil rights protests. Then also, but the children themselves, once they became involved in civil rights campaigns, and they organized their own protests because they could see that the facilities, for example, the public school boycotts, which took place in the 1940s and 1950s, for example, at Moton High School in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which became the case that was brought by the high school students when they organized the boycott. The boycott lasted several weeks. NAACP took up their case. Their case was included in the Brown decision. So one of the cases that made up the Brown decision was brought by teenagers, brought by high school students at Moton High School. But in other parts of the country, throughout the country, where the public school facilities for Black students were inferior, they were inadequate, and compared to what the white public schools had, resources that they had at the same time. And so the students then organized their own a boycott of the Black public school in order to, either to gain additional resources and improvements in the all Black public school. That's what they asked for first, but gradually they also wanted to have access to the resources that were available at all white public schools. So those boycotts were organized by the students themselves to try to improve the conditions in the all Black schools, or to allow them access to the improved quality schooling that was available to white students only previously. Then the other area, which I document in cities across the country, beginning in the late 1960s, and we're talking about 1965, 1966, 1967, many students, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles, students organized walkouts and boycotts demanding more African American teachers in these public schools. They walked out, they organized a boycott to have Black history courses offered on a regular basis at the school. And they organized boycotts in support of the civil rights campaigns that were taking place in the city, and where certain public school staff and faculty may have been penalized. That, in other words, you had the teachers, cafeteria workers, janitors who participated in civil rights campaigns and they lost their jobs. And the students in the high school would organize a boycott until those staff members, those Blacks, got their jobs back. So it's a combination. The students were recruited to desegregate previously all white institutions, and they organized their own protests to gain access to public schools that they had previously been barred from. And they organized protests in order to change the curriculum in these schools to include the history of Africa and the history of African Americans in the United States.
Now, in your previous remarks, you mentioned activism in Los Angeles. And in the book, you talk about activism specifically at Jefferson High School and at Fremont High School in the City of Angels. Are you able to expand upon that for our audience?
Yes, well, you have to keep in mind that, again, at Jefferson High School, the issue was the inadequate resources that were available. And also the issue was to have more African-American teachers and administrators, and to have Black history courses taught in those schools. And in Los Angeles, the students at Fremont and Jefferson High School joined with the Mexican-American students who were organizing their own protests to have Mexican-American teachers, Mexican Spanish language bilingual classes in their high schools, and to have the teaching of Mexican American and Mexican history in their schools and stuff. And so the blowouts, the Black students at Jefferson and Fremont supported the blowouts that Mexican American students were organizing and participating in. So the result of this was the introduction of Black history courses in those schools, and also in the Mexican American high schools, you had bilingual courses introduced, and you had increased number of Mexican American teachers. And so this was a joint, and I'm talking about 1968 and 1969, when the Black students and Mexican American students in Los Angeles joined together, formed boycotts, what they sometimes call blowouts, and to bring about changes and improvements in the public schools in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't mind, let's fast forward to recent times. We know that of late, demagogic politicians have been referring to many Black youth as predators and parts of wolf packs. There have been attempts to have the death penalty extended to juveniles and life sentences without parole for juveniles. Do you see this as some sort of reaction to youth activism?
Oh, yes. This is definitely the youth activism that was fomented as a result of police violence. It was the police violence in Ferguson, in Chicago, in various cities and towns across the country, culminating in the death of George Floyd, that spurred this anti-racist mobilization by teenagers and young people. In some cities, such as Atlanta and Philadelphia, it was the teenagers who organized the protests around the killing of George Floyd. In other words, it was Black Lives Matter groups organized protests, but the teenagers and the young people organized protests themselves. And so what you have going on subsequently is a backlash. There's a backlash against that mobilization that took place. And so the result is that you have the continuation of this mass incarceration that has afflicted the United States and afflicted particularly Black youth in the United States over the last 2 decades at least. And so the protests led to some reforms on the part of police and police departments, some reforms. And so this is what we're up against and what the young people are up against now. The call for reform of the police is still going on, and young people are participating in campaigns to bring about reforms. But on the conservative side, you have these politicians providing more funds for the police that is to institute all kinds of more repressive apparatus within the police department, because they're saying that what we need is to support the police and to empower the police, given the increase in gun violence that's taken place, particularly over the last half decade.
Finally, Professor Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at UC Riverside, author of the recently published book, The Young Crusaders, The Untold Story of the Children and Teenagers Who Galvanized the Civil Rights Movement. What should your loyal readers be looking for from you next? And allied to that, what advice would you give to young people who want to be the next VP Franklin?
I have, in the latter part of the book, in the epilogue of the book, I discuss the Young Black Lives Matter, Movement for Black Lives, Young Youth Project 100, and various groups that have come to understand that the movement to obtain reparations, and I discussed this in the epilogue of the book, that these young people have come to understand that if their situation is going to prove, if we're going to have any kind of redistribution of the wealth, it will be through a program of reparatory justice, reparations to those who have been abused, who have been mistreated, who have been injured by the activities of corporate capitalism in the United States. And so I am a member of the National African American Reparations Commission, and we have, as many know, have reintroduced H.R. 40, the bill to create a commission, a national commission to put forward proposals for reparations for African Americans. I'm a member of that commission, and so we're doing that. But we also, the National African American Reparations Commission is also working with activists in cities and towns across the country to create their own reparations movement and reparations task force, similar to what has been created in the state of California. And as you may know, in the case of Evanston, Illinois, the Reparations Commission that was created by the City Council actually has paid reparations for the damage that had been done to Black families due to housing discrimination in the city of Evanston from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And so Black families have received reparations from the city of Evanston for that discrimination. And so my advice to young people is to pay attention to the reparations movement and the reparations activities that are taking place, or to initiate their own reparatory justice campaigns in order to improve, to deal with the disparities. That's what we face. We have disparities in education, we have disparities in housing, we have disparities in healthcare. And so mobilizing and creating a reparations task force, a reparations commission to try to redistribute the taxpayers' funds in that locale to try to address these specific disparities in health, in incarceration, in housing that exist between Black families and white families in that locale. So in the 21st century, I hope the young people will be pursuing reparatory justice and involving themselves in reparations campaigns at the local, national, and even at the global level.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at UC Riverside, and author of the book, The Young Crusaders, The Untold Story of the Children and Teenagers Who Galvanized the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Arleen Marcia Tuchman from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Find yourself a Black-owned bookstore near you today and continue the learning by grabbing her book, Diabetes: History of Race and Disease. Thank you to VP Franklin, Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Riverside, for joining the show this morning. And while you're in that bookstore, why not grab his book, The Young Crusaders, The Untold Story of the Children and Teenagers Who Galvanized the Civil Rights Movement. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best in guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Dida and Kamathi. Shout out to Sister Zioni on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.